Good afternoon, alien enthusiasts. In spite of what some of you may be thinking right now, I have not sunk to extreme clickbaity titles, not in the least with this particular topic. As shocked as I was to learn this news, it is based on scientific data. Be rest assured, I'm going to prove that to you in this video, but let's go ahead and continue with the topic. One of the biggest challenges that we've had with 3I Atlas is the fact that it's still so far away that even with our best telescopes, such as the Hubble, we can only get a vague idea as to what this object looks like because we only get a resolution of a few arc seconds on the entire object, both whatever the halo is that surrounds it and its nucleus. And with so little information, it's very difficult to determine exactly what it might be, in spite of the fact that astronomers seem 100% convinced that it's a comet, and woe betide anybody who says anything different. That being the case, though, there is one thing that has been very strange about 3I Atlas, something that was recognized right from the start. How can it possibly be so bright? The latest observed magnitude as of right now for 3I Atlas is 16.4 at a distance of about 400 million kilometers from Earth. That is not terribly bright. There are certainly other comets that have been brighter, but only gigantic comets. If we're talking about comets that are relatively small, the sorts of comets that we would expect to encounter with interstellar objects, this is anomalous. This is strangely bright. And once again, astronomers have struggled to explain why this is. But now we have a possible explanation. The 3I Atlas might be generating its own light, artificial light, and amazingly, it's backed up by the data. Good afternoon, alien enthusiasts, and welcome to another Angry Alien Bulletin. I really did not expect to be doing another video about 3I Atlas this soon, but this is breaking news in a big way. Really, I should have released a video about this yesterday because I knew about it more than 24 hours ago, but I really wanted to put something out was a little bit more familiar to my spaceflight fans, folks who've been watching my channel for a long time, and man, was that a mistake. Something about Elon Musk's plans to go to Mars, his objectives of sending a human-rated mission in the next few years. Nobody wants to hear about that anymore, it seems, at least as far as my subscribers are concerned. And I'll be talking a little bit more about what that means for the channel at the end of the video. So let's go ahead and proceed to this particular topic. 3I Atlas, again, in the news in a big way. Most astronomers are absolutely enraged that Avi Loeb is bringing up the unconventional, sort of exotic possibilities for this object to explain why it is the way it is. And the latest one, well, that is the most dramatic of all. And once again, as I said at the beginning of this video, this is not some sort of clickbaity thing saying that we've detected lights on Proxima b and all of these other ridiculous headlines that we've seen on YouTube in the past. This is something that is actually backed up by observational data. And that is something to do with the brightness of this object. That is what has always been so confusing about 3I Atlas. How is it as bright as it is? As I have mentioned in previous videos, we are talking about an object that's at least 200 times brighter than the interstellar comet 2I Borisov was at the same distance. As a matter of fact, we didn't even know 2I Borisov was there when it was that far away because it was just much dimmer. So, of course, the theories have varied far and wide. Avi Loeb talks about it being a much bigger object. Astronomers just say that it's a much smaller object that's producing an enormous amount of dust. Dust, of course, being the catch-all explanation for everything we don't understand in the universe when it comes to alien megastructures, all sorts of things that we see in the cosmos. Dust is the explanation that astronomers love to present present. And if you don't agree with the dust explanation, then you're a nut job and you don't deserve to have your papers published. But in any event, all of that having been said, even that explanation doesn't make any sense, because how is an object like 3I Atlas producing this much dust without any detectable outgassing? Because the spectrographic analyses that have been done of this object thus far has indicated no gas whatsoever. You can't have explosive outgassing with lots and lots of dust without also having a lot of gas mixed in with that outgassing, and yet we've seen no evidence of that whatsoever. The only way that an object could produce this much dust without outgassing is if it were huge, again, about 20 kilometers in diameter, which once again makes it a very, very unusual object. Something this big should not be encountering our solar system very often. We're talking maybe once every 50,000 years. So either we got very, very lucky, or that's just not the explanation we'd be looking towards. So if it's not a bright dust cloud and it's not an enormous object, then what could possibly be creating this much light? Well, that's where the artificial light explanation comes from. The 3I Atlas might be generating its own light, and for an object of this size, an artificial explanation is about the only one we've got. And by the way, stay tuned to the end where I'm going to give my own interpretation of what 3I Atlas might be from an artificial perspective. But let's go ahead and turn to Avi Loeb, the only guy who tends to talk about these sorts of topics, to see what he thinks about this latest data. One thing about this object, by the way, as I mentioned before, is it's very, very difficult to get any sort of good image on this object at this kind of distance. If, however, we utilize the cameras on the Juno spacecraft, if it were to be diverted towards 3I Atlas, even if it only had enough fuel to get within 25 million kilometers from 3I Atlas, it could get a much better image of this object. The other alternative would be to turn the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter towards 3I Atlas and utilize the high-rise camera on this orbiter. If we were to do that, we could also get a much better image of this object. However, at this time, NASA still is not aggressively exploring these possibilities. That being the case, then we have to go with what we've got. And one thing that we do have is an analysis of the brightness profile of the glow of 3I Atlas. And have a look at this figure, something that's actually a little difficult to interpret, and I have a hard time interpreting it also, but the one thing to keep in mind is how steep the slope is. It is a projected power law slope of -3, which implies a three-dimensional emissivity profile with a radial power law slope of -4. Now, what all that garbage means is that this object has a much steeper light curve than we have observed in natural comets. So together with a colleague named Eric Quito, Avi Loeb realized that the observed slope of -4 is consistent with an alternative model in which the dust outflow around 3I Atlas is being illuminated by a central source. In other words, this object is creating its own light, not reflected light, light being generated by the object itself. This model naturally accounts for the steep brightness profile, since the outflow density scope of -2 is accompanied by the radial decline of the illuminating radiation flux, with an additionally declining slope of -2. In other words, just a very, very steep slope, which suggests a light source at the center of the cloud. If 3I Atlas generates its own light, then it could be much smaller than expected from a model that reflects sunlight. The reflection model requires a diameter of up to 20 kilometers, which is untenable given that the limited reservoir of rocky material in interstellar space can only deliver a giant rock once every 10,000 years or so. And given how unusual those sorts of encounters are, the fact that this object is also coming at the solar system on the plane of the ecliptic, coming close to 3 different planets in the same journey. We've talked about these things before. All of these things combined make for an extremely unlikely natural object. But Avi Loeb did some number crunching to determine what sort of luminosity 3I Atlas needs to be generating in order to produce the observed luminosity. First of all, he calculated that the luminosity of 3I Atlas needs to be on the order of 10 gigawatts worth of light energy. That's enough energy to be generated by about 10 nuclear reactors or so, a colossal amount of power. Secondly, he realized that the steep brightness profile around 3I Atlas implies that the nucleus dominates the observed light. Again, that corresponds to the nucleus actually generating the light. This must hold irrespective of the origin of the light. In other words, the nucleus dominates over the emission from the glow around it. The illumination by sunlight cannot explain this steep profile of scattered light. Sunlight would dominate the illumination in this model because a rocky nucleus would reflect only a small fraction of the solar intensity from a much smaller area than the 10,000 kilometer region resolved in the Hubble Space Telescope image. Another possibility for the steep brightness profile is that the scattering halo is made of icy particles that get evaporated as they move towards the sun from the warm sun-facing side of 3I Atlas. This would explain why there's no tail of these scattering particles, but it's unclear as to whether this would lead to the observed brightness profile, and it's very unlike a comet, even if it is natural. Now, the simplest interpretation, if I can use Occam's razor against the skeptics for a change, is that the nucleus of 3I Atlas is actually producing most of the light. It was calculated that the nucleus cannot be a thermal emitter with an effective surface temperature below 1,000 degrees Kelvin, or else its peak emission wavelength would have been longer than 3 micrometers with an exponential cutoff at shorter wavelengths, which is incompatible with the data. At higher effective temperatures, the required luminosity of 3I Atlas can be obtained from a source diameter which is smaller than 100 meters. A compact, bright emitter would make 3I Atlas of comparable size to the previous interstellar objects such as Oumuamua or 2I Borisov, making more sense in the 20-kilometer size inferred in the model where it reflects sunlight. But what could constitute this light source? First of all, Avi calculated that a primordial black hole with a Hawking temperature of 1,000 degrees Kelvin would produce only 20 nanowatts of power, clearly insufficient to power this light source. A natural nuclear source could be a rare fragment from the core of a nearby supernova that is rich in radioactive material. This possibility is highly unlikely, though, given the scarce reservoir of radioactive elements in interstellar space. Alternatively, 3I Atlas could be a spacecraft powered by nuclear energy, and the dust emitted from its frontal surface might be from dirt that is accumulated on its surface during interstellar travel. Dr. Loeb also explored the possibility of this object traveling so fast through this dust cloud, through all of the extra dust that seems to exist in the medium around the object, that friction might actually be creating the light. But that seems to be ruled out. We can't imagine an interplanetary environment where there is that much dust to create that much friction, meaning, once again, the simplest explanation is that this is an artificial object. It's difficult to even imagine a natural object this small that can generate this much light on its own. And of course, the artificial explanation would also coincide with the other strange things that we have noticed about this object's trajectory. The fact that it happens to be approaching our solar system on the plane of the ecliptic, that it happens to be passing less than 1 astronomical unit away from Mars, together with Venus and Jupiter. As a matter of fact, this object is passing much less than 1 astronomical unit away from Mars and Jupiter, so close in fact that it could easily dispatch interplanetary probes to all 3 of these destinations utilizing objects as simple as human-made intercontinental ballistic missiles. really wouldn't need a lot of delta V to carry out an intercept of all three of these planets if 3I Atlas were the mothership. And then, of course, finally, this object is passing on the opposite side of the sun from where Earth will be during its closest approach, making human observation of this object that much more difficult. Again, possibly by design. All right, so this is what Avi Loeb has had to say about 3I Atlas. Just amazing, amazing discovery. Once again, appears to be backed up by the data. But if this object were artificial, then what might it be? And what is this halo, this dust cloud that surrounds it? Avi Loeb has talked about the possibility of it perhaps being matter sprayed out in front of the object to detect any sort of hazards that might exist out there, any small objects that at this speed colliding with 3I Atlas would be utterly devastating. But I have another suggestion, something based on another astronomical phenomena that we observed a few years ago that's every bit as mysterious and also involved what astronomers at first thought was dust, but later on figured out that it couldn't possibly be that. Imagine if the rings of Saturn suddenly disappeared. Astronomers a few years ago witnessed the equivalent around a young sun-like star called TYC 8241-2652. Enormous amounts of dust known to circle the star were suddenly nowhere to be found. Quote, "It's like the classic magician's trick. Now you see it, now you don't. Only in this case we're talking about enough dust to fill an inner solar system, and it really is gone," according to Carl Mellis of the University of California, San Diego, who led the new study, appearing in the July 5th issue of the journal Nature, but this is back in 2012, so this study's been around for a while, and it still remains unexplained, by the way. A dusty disk around TYC 8241-2652 was first seen by the NASA Infrared Astronomical Satellite in 1983, and it continued to glow brightly for 25 years. The dust was thought to be due to collisions between forming planets, a natural part of planetary formation. Like Earth, warm dust absorbs the energy of visible starlight and re-radiates that energy as infrared or heat radiation. The first strong indication of the disk's disappearance came from images taken in January of 2010 by NASA's Wide Field Infrared Survey Explorer, or WISE. An infrared image obtained at the Gemini telescope in Chile on May the 1st, 2012 confirmed that the dust had now been gone for 2.5 years. Quote, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in the many hundreds of stars that astronomers have studied for dust rings," according to the co-author Ben Zuckerman of UCLA. This disappearance is remarkably fast even on a human timescale, much less on an astronomical scale. The dust disappearance at TYC 8241-2652 was so bizarre and so quick, initially I figured that our observations must simply be wrong in some strange way. Bizarre natural explanations such as a black hole moving through the system, gobbling up all the dust in the process, were discarded when no evidence of any black hole in the vicinity was found. A black hole devouring that much matter would have given off a lot of visible light for years after the encounter, and there was no evidence of that at all. Just trillions of tons of dust, many trillions of tons, suddenly vanished over the course of just a few decades. So since no natural explanations were ever found, what might have been an artificial explanation? Well, I postulated that perhaps a large number of nanomachines bent on devouring matter and converting it into perhaps usable fuel or some other material being used by a machine civilization seeking to grow, building more duplicates of itself, or some other kind of application for this matter might have moved through the solar system, devouring all of this dust as it passed through. And if 3I Atlas is a nuclear-powered mothership of some kind, perhaps what we are observing is a cloud of of nanomachines moving in front of the object, consuming whatever interplanetary matter it can find, and then bringing that matter back to the ship for conversion into usable fuel. Or, given the fact that interplanetary dust tends to be made up of useful materials such as silicates, iron, nickel, and iron sulfur compounds, organic compounds, ices, that sort of thing, the sort of material that might be able to sustain a large population on board this ship. Perhaps these nanomachines are busily gathering these materials before the ship makes its way back into interstellar space, where these materials are far, far less common. If this is the case, then we must closely watch this object to see whether or not this halo, this cloud of dust or whatever it is, disappears. If it were to vanish after the nanomachines are finished doing their job, assuming that they have a completion date for their job, then that would be a dead giveaway, and exactly like we observed with this mysterious disappearing solar system. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you can see that I definitely wasn't clickbaiting here, guys. This is real news based on real scientific data. Sure, speculative. Sure, perhaps a bit bold and exotic, but at the same time, definitely not some crazy claim that isn't backed up by facts. And it is this that makes the 3I Atlas story so incredibly interesting. As this object continues to make its way through the solar system, and as it gets closer, we're going to learn more and more about it. And once again, even if it is natural, it's a natural object that's been out there far longer than our solar system has been in existence. Who knows what strange phenomena it might have encountered on its journey? May have come within some sort of close contact with a black hole, got slingshotted around by that. Who knows what has happened to this object on its journey? But regardless, I think it's very possible that we're going to find out that this thing is quite unique, whatever it is. And once again, it is completely irresponsible to dismiss an artificial possibility. Thank you very much for watching. Once again, in terms of what I said more towards the beginning of the video, as far as content is concerned, the video I released yesterday is something that would have been really popular a couple of years ago, talking about Elon Musk's claims of a manned mission to Mars, how likely that would be, the pros and cons, etc. But I'll tell you, it's just not anymore, at least not with my viewing base. It was one of the most unsuccessful videos that I've released lately, and I am unlikely to do it again. And once again, it's not because the algorithm thinks that this is a UFO channel now and it's not promoting it. In terms of the percentage of my subscribers and the percentage of viewers who are actually clicking on it, it is ridiculously unpopular right now. Probably not going to be doing another video along those lines. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to be doing any more spaceflight related content or anything like that. But yesterday's video, and spend at least 8 hours on it, and I'm probably going to make about $20, about $2.50 an hour for the time invested. I'm just not going to be able to make a living doing those kinds of videos. So don't lose hope, spaceflight fans. I will continue to do the types of videos that you enjoy. In the meantime, if you want to help keep this channel afloat and keep my original goal of a mixed content, of having mostly spaceflight with UFO and some exotic topics mixed in, well, you can also support me on Patreon. All the details are in the description. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, stay angry about space.